Hello, Faithful Politics listeners. This is Josh Bertram, your faithful host, and we are joined today by Will Wright, our political host. Will, how's it going?
It's going excellent. Thanks, Josh.
Absolutely. And today as a guest, we have Professor Massimo Piggliucci. He's been a writer for quite some time as a PhD in Evolutionary Biology from the University of Connecticut and also one in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He's currently the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. And his research interests include the philosophy of science, nature of pseudoscience, practical philosophies like Stoicism and the New Skepticism. At last count, Professor Pigliucci has published 178 technical papers. Do you have more now, or is this out of?
I think it's one or two more, yes.
I mean, why not just add another 10 or so, whatever. And he's got technical papers in science and philosophy, and also the author or editor of 16 books, including the best-selling How to Be a Stoic, on Stilts, and the newest, or How to Be a Stoic, the Nonsense on Stilts, and then the newest and most recent, The Quest for Character, which is what we have him on today to talk about, and then any other subjects that we somehow find ourselves in. So, Professor Massimo, can I call you Massimo?
Yes.
I think we did this last time. We went through this whole song and dance last time. He's been on the show before. How are things going since last time we talked?
Well, there's been a pandemic, and so a few things have happened since. But I guess overall, pretty good. We're doing well.
Well, good. Well, thanks so much for being on the show today. And so we'll get right into it. So you have this new book, The Quest for Character: What the Story of Socrates and Alcibiades. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's
Alcibiades. Right. Look at that. That's what happens when you're a pastor. You have to learn to say really hard words for English speakers because it's all in Hebrew and then Greek. So what this teaches us about our search for good leaders. So interesting title, fascinating subject. Tell us, why'd you write this book?
Well, the beginning of the idea for the book was precisely the fact that I've always been fascinated with the figure of Alcibiades. I am actually stunned that nobody's made a movie out of the guy's life. Because, so think about it this way. He lived in 5th century BC Athens. He was impossibly handsome, super rich, very smart, very brave. So he was the kind of guy that, of course, was destined to do either great things or great misdeeds. And it turns out he did both. So he became, in fact, the leader of Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Then he was put on trial by the Athenians. He defected to the Spartans and did a lot of damage to Athens while being on the Spartan side. And then when I was there, he had a baby with the king's wife. The Spartan king did not appreciate for some reason. Yeah. And so then the Spartans were after him. So he defected again, this time to the Persians, which were common enemies of both the Spartans and the Athenians. And then he did other misdeeds there. In the end, everybody was after him. And sure enough, he was eventually killed by Persian spies incited by the Spartans. But, in all of this, he was his life was a series of dramatic reversals and, incredible victories. He pulled off some of the major victories for Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and then just as incredible, disasters. So he was a really interesting guy. Now, however, why do I care as a philosopher about somebody like that? Because he also happened to be Socrates' student, friend, and possibly lover. And so things become interesting now because Socrates is arguably the most famous philosopher, and he's famous particularly for his insistence on a life of virtue and, wisdom and all that sort of stuff, which seems not at all what Alcibiades actually did. And so I was intrigued by the relationship between these two, and that got me thinking about the more general relationship between ethics and politics, where ethics is represented by Socrates and politics is represented by Alcibiades. So that's how the idea of the book came about.
That's interesting. So I'm going to make sure it's now my turn to mispronounce this. Alcibiades?
Yeah.
Yes. Score one for the Liberty.
Awesome. Score one.
I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about him as we talk, but as far as Socrates is concerned, like it's a name I'm familiar with. It's not a name I haven't, or a person that I haven't really thought much about since, I don't know, high school, my first year of college or something like that. So
Philosophy 101.
Yeah. So can you maybe just give us, a bio of who Socrates is, and, why he's sort of a critical part of this book as well?
Yeah, Socrates was actually a stonemason. That was his job, his day job. But in fact, he spent most of his time talking to the Athenian youth and as well as to Athenian politicians, trying to convince them that a good life is a life where you work on your character, you become a better person, and you're helpful to others. You can kind of think of him as a street preacher of these days, except that it wasn't really yelling at people. He was pushing people to think in new ways, in ways that perhaps they had never considered, to question opinions that they took for granted. And he did that for several decades, more or less successfully, depending on who you ask. And then eventually, of course, as people of that kind often do, he got in trouble with the authorities. And he was brought up for trial for corruption of the youth, of all things. In other words, for teaching. and he was in fact condemned. He was found guilty by the Athenian assembly. Now, interestingly, when you were found guilty, Athens was a democracy at the time, so this was a popular vote, right? And once you were found guilty by the assembly, you had the option to come back and suggest a punishment that would fit the alleged crime. And typically what people did, if they were condemned, they would try to avoid the death penalty, which was a possibility. And so they would say, okay, I'm going to go into exile. So I'm going to move somewhere else. I'm not going to bother you guys at all. So what does Socrates say? Everybody's expecting that he's going to do that. Instead, he says, look, I've done such a good job in the city that I think you guys should vote me a pension for the rest of my life because, in appreciation of what I did. And of course, he was being sarcastic. So they have a second vote this time to determine whether the punishment should be death or not. And more people voted for death than originally voted to convict, right? So clearly, he did not obtain the result that he wanted. Or perhaps he did want that result because there is a speculation that Socrates actually knew that the outcome was probably inevitably going to be that one. It was not going to be favorable, and he decided to just go out. He was fairly old by the standards of the time. He was about 70. So that's Socrates. He became a pivotal figure in the history of philosophy because he was the first philosopher in the Western tradition to really turn from abstract theoretical speculations about metaphysics and how the world works into to ethics, to how we should behave, how we should relate to each other, what is important in life and what is not important in life. So he's the founder of a long line of philosophical practice that goes from ancient Greece all the way to modern Stoicism.
So I love that. Socrates is always an interesting character to me for a variety of reasons, as I'm sure that we'll probably get into as we're talking through the book. So one of the things you talk about right in the book is the idea of virtues, and I'm seeing that. There's these cardinal virtues that you mention, and so what is, you start to talk about virtues and you put it, in the context of the story of Alcibiades and Socrates. So what is the basic kind of big idea and summary of the book, so that, and help us understand, like, what's the big thesis that you want us to take away as we read it?
So that's a great question. The big thesis is that there is typically a gap, as modern sociologist and psychologist Kristen Miller puts it, between who we want to be in terms of character and who we actually are. We all want to, most people want to be good people. Except for a few psychopaths and sociopaths here and there. But,
right.
Most of us, there's empirical evidence of this. I'm not just being Pollyannish here. There's actually fairly solid empirical evidence that most people want to be good. In fact, most people think that they are good. It's like the same kind of data surveys that show that everybody thinks that they're a better driver than average, right? Which of course is impossible.
Above average, yes.
Yeah, they're all above average, right? Which of course is not possible by definition of average.
Yes.
So the basic thesis of the book is we've all been probably since the dawn of humanity, but certainly since the dawn of modern a writing societies, literate societies capable of talking and writing about these things. We've all been on a quest for character. We've all been on a quest for becoming better people. And then the thesis of the book is not only this is important for every one of us, but it's important particularly for our leaders, for statesmen, for politicians, because these are the people who actually lead the rest of us somewhere. And so if they are not virtuous, if they don't have a good character, then we're all in trouble. And so then the question is, well, how do you, in fact, proceed with the quest for character? What can you do that improves your character? Is it possible to teach virtue to people? That's the first chapter in the book starts with that question. Can we actually teach virtue? But before answering that question, we should step back for a second and say, well, what are we talking about here? What is virtue and what is character, right? So character is understood by modern philosophers and social scientists as a set of behavioral tendencies. So tendencies to behave in a certain way. For instance, if you say, my friend Will is generous, then what you mean by that is that other things being equal, not necessarily always, but other things being equal, Will is going to be acting generously. So he's going to devote his time or his money or his resources to other people, right? And if he's not generous, if he's ungenerous or stingy or whatever it is, he's going to do the exact opposite, right? So that's what we mean by character. Now, virtue is a fundamental aspect, a positive aspect of character. The word actually comes from the Greek arete, which just means excellence. You can have an excellent anything, for instance, not just an excellent human being, but an excellent anything. For instance, you can have an excellent knife. Now, what is an excellent knife? It's a knife that does its job well, that functions correctly as far as knives are concerned, which means it cuts well, right? If it is a blunt knife, then it's not an excellent knife. It's not a knife that does its job. So similarly, the Greco-Romans thought that there are human functions. There are things that the human beings should do. And then you can measure, once we agree on what those things are, then you can measure how well a human being actually is arete, how excellent he is or she is to do that thing. And what would be the function of a human being? Well, according to most of the Greco-Romans, there are two things that really set aside our species from any other species on the planet. One is that we're capable of reason at a high level. Other animals may be capable of some level of reason, but we are the only ones there that talk on computers across the world. Nobody else does that sort of stuff. And we are highly pro-social. So we're social animals. We need to cooperate with each other in order to thrive. Now, again, there are other animals that are also social, of course, other social primates, for instance, or social insects. But no animal society in the world is as complicated, structured, and interdependent as human society. So to be an excellent human being, to be a virtuous human being, means that you reason well and you act pro-socially, that you cooperate with other people, right? And that is what virtue is. That it's mindful, intelligent cooperation with other people.
I love that. I love the specificity of it, and it makes sense. I've often thought about hey, what does distinguish us from the animals, because in the Christian tradition and Hebrew tradition, the idea of the image of God, the idea of what does it mean, the human anthropology from a biblical perspective or Jewish or Christian, Judeo-Christian perspective, like what does that mean? And reason, like we are from Aristotle, rational souls, right? So this idea, and that was definitely taken and used in the church quite a bit. So you've defined virtues, which is awesome. That you're pro-social because of the complicated nature of our structure and interdependency of our human society, and that we can reason. I love that. That seems good. I might, as a pastor, add some things on, but I think that's a great,
Of course.
great thing. But that's okay. That's why we're having this conversation. But here's my question. We want to get to, can virtue be taught? And maybe that's the one, but almost you could answer either of these. I think they can interchange in terms of when we answer them. The first one is, what virtues are the most important? I know that you begin to kind of define that. What virtues are most important? We know reason, but is there something more specific that we can get down to in terms of virtues? What virtues are most important, and then how can they be taught? But I guess we'll address those differently. What virtues are most important, do you think? What did you find?
So in the Greco-Roman tradition recognizes 4 cardinal virtues, 4 very, very broad virtues, each one of which then comes with kind of sub-virtues. So the list is actually long. If you look at Aristotle, he has at least 12 that he lists. But the fundamental 4 are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the knowledge of what is truly good for you or not good for you. Not what other people tell you, but what really is. So to be wise is to have knowledge of essentially what your priorities should be, what your values should be, etc. Courage is the propensity to act on those values, even if it costs you, in one way or another. Justice is means to behave fairly toward other people, treating people with respect, treating people the way in which you would want to be treated. And then temperance means that you do things in right measure, neither too much nor too little. Now, as I'm sure you know, those are 4 of the 7 Christian virtues. Thomas Aquinas picked those 4 straight from Plato and the Stoics, and then added 3 more, which are, I think, hope, faith, and charity. So right there, you can see how there is a lot of overlap and compatibility actually between the Christian tradition and the Greco-Roman. I mean, one builds on top of the other to some extent. Of course, they're not quite the same. So those are the fundamental 4. Now, the next question is, okay, so if these are the virtues, can we teach them? Can we actually teach somebody to be more virtuous? And here is interesting that in the first chapter of the book, I go into this. Socrates gives 2 different answers to that question. In a Platonic dialogue known as the Meno, he says, no, we can't teach virtue. And he reaches that conclusion because he says, look, if we could, then you would see teachers of virtue around, because it's an important thing to be taught virtue. And I don't see any teachers, he says. Therefore, probably can't be done, because if somebody could, they would do it. However, in another Platonic dialogue, the Protagoras, he changes his mind. And he changes his mind, interestingly, by talking to Protagoras, who is a sophist. Now, generally speaking, the sophists were the arch enemies of Socrates. So it's kind of interesting. They had very different opinions and very different views about how to do philosophy. But so it's interesting that there is a dialogue where it is a sophist of all people who actually changes Socrates' mind. And Protagoras makes the following argument. He says, yes, you can teach virtue, because virtue is what the Greeks called a techne. It's a technique. It's a skill. It's similar to learning a musical instrument. So if you think about it in terms of learning a musical instrument, how do you learn a musical instrument? Well, you need to do 3 things. 1, you need a little bit of theory. It's good to know basic stuff about the notes and how they relate to each other, that sort of thing, because otherwise you kind of not know what you're doing when you're playing. So that's that's one component. The second component is you need a good teacher. You can learn to play an instrument on your own, but it's much better if you do it with a teacher, because the teacher will, point out where you have bad form, where you can improve, and it tells you how you can improve, etc. And then most of the time, you just practice. Right? You practice the scales, you practice simple tunes, then you go on and practice more and more complex tunes. That sort of stuff. Now, Protagoras says the same thing goes with virtue. You need a little bit of theory. That's where philosophy comes in, about what the virtues are and what how to think about your values and your priorities, etc., etc. That's the theory. Ideally, you need a teacher, if you can find a good teacher. So a Socrates, for instance, would be a good one, right? Or anybody who you think knows what they're doing in that term. So anybody who is a good person and have thought about how to be a good person. And then, most important, you need practice. Practice, practice, practice. Now, we all understand how it is possible to practice a musical instrument, but how do you practice virtue? Right. So let's say that you have a conversation with your teacher and you realize that, one of the virtues where you're a little bit deficient is generosity. It's like you say, I like to be generous, but I recognize that that's not one of my strong suits. So I need to improve that aspect of my character. Well, there's a number of ways you can do that. For instance, you could decide every morning before you leave the house to put some change in your pockets and then give that change to the first homeless person you find. Initially, that behavior will be counterintuitive for you. It would be like not the kind of thing you would normally do, which is exactly the problem. But because you're mindfully engaged in it, you're going to do it, you made a commitment to do it, then the idea is that the more you do it, day after day, or not even every day, but several times a week, or whatever you can actually put into practice. The more you do it, the more it becomes second nature. The more it becomes obvious that, of course, that's the thing to do. Of course, I should be helpful to other people, etc., etc. So that's how you actually practice virtue. And you can practice all of the virtues. Practice temperance is very easy. Almost we have plenty of occasions during the day of practicing temperance. For instance, when you're on social media. I'm no longer on social media, but when I was on social media, practice temperance was a day-to-day thing, because you don't want to get angry at the next schmuck who is going to tell you something stupid. And there's plenty of schmucks who tell you something stupid on social media. So practicing temperance means, okay, I'm not going to react to this one, right? I'm going to think twice before I respond to that sort of stuff. You can practice temperance. Musonius Rufus, who was a first century Stoic philosopher, said you can practice temperance at least 3 times a day, every time you have a meal. Yeah. Because you can control how much you eat, what you eat, etc., etc. That's another way to practice temperance. So that's how you do it. Now, of course, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to slip up, just like what happens when you practice an instrument, right? You're going to start doing the scale, and then, I hit the wrong note. Or you're going to play a simple tune, and then, I got the wrong note. Well, you don't give up just because you hit the wrong note. You pick up the instrument again, and you start over. And even people who are very, very advanced, even professional musicians, will make mistakes once in a while. Far less frequently than you or I, probably, but even they make mistakes. Nobody is perfect. And the same goes for virtue. If you find yourself not doing the virtuous thing one day, you get really angry with somebody that you shouldn't have been getting angry with, for instance, or you overeat at dinner even though you know that that's not good for you, or you drink too much even though you know that that's not good for you. That's okay. The following day, you start over and you say, okay, I made a mistake yesterday. That's it. Done. Let's start over. So that's how you practice virtue, and that's how you become more virtuous. Now, some people, again, the analogy with music is really good. Protagoras was really a smart guy, because it also clearly shows why is it that everybody can improve, can be taught virtue. But some people are going to be naturally more virtuous than others. Just like you have, the natural prodigy in music, you have the Mozart, the occasional Mozart, right? Yes, that's true. Most of us are not Mozarts, and some of us, in fact, are so bad that even when we're taught, we barely put together, a few notes. But everybody can improve if they exercise, if they understand a little bit of theory, and if they have a good teacher. Even Mozart. I mean, Mozart himself, took lessons. It's not like he just went off and on his own. So.
Yeah, totally. Like, I know that, or at least I've heard that his dad heavily edited many of his early writings. Like his dad was like one of the top violinists and at the time.
Exactly.
So, and like wrote like the guide for like music. So he wasn't just some random person that became Mozart. But I would say, it's so fascinating. One thing that it's a little bit of a side question, but it could turn into a big one. What's the connection, like in your research, how did you find the brain, body, I know the brain is the body, but how did you find like that, like what is virtue in the brain? Can we see it in the brain? Does it like, and what is like some of the science behind practice that makes it so that we know that as we practice something, it doesn't just change our actions, but it changes our attitudes.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Attitudes and moods.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, broadly speaking, we know that the brain has what neuroscientists call an executive function. So the ability to think more or less rationally about things and make decisions. That's in the frontoparietal lobes of the brain. So it's in the front and on the side of our brain. That's where our rational decision making and is essentially situated. And then we have at the base of the brain something called the amygdala, which is where our emotional reactions come out. So when you feel, for instance, anger or fear or something like that, it starts with a release of hormones at the back of your brain, at the bottom of your brain. Now, we also know from modern science that these two areas are deeply interconnected. There are literally billions of neurons and neuronal connections between these two, which means that although a lot of people tend to think of sort of the ability to reason and the ability to experience emotions as separate, they're not. They're highly integrated, right? Which is why the Greco-Romans and the Stoics in particular thought that you could actually talk to your emotions, right? You could reason with your emotions. You could improve your emotional responses by paying attention to when is it, for instance, you get angry, what kind of situations, what works or doesn't work to get you out of those situations, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the basis for a number of modern psychotherapies, including cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most successful evidence-based approaches to modifying human behavior. So in that sense, you don't literally see the virtues, of course, because virtues are a conceptualization of behavioral tendencies. But you do see the brain. You can literally scan the brain while you're making decisions, and you can see how your brain reacts depending on what kind of decision you're making, what the emotional component of that decision is, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that we do know from modern neuroscience is that character tends to get stabilized around the early 20s, late teens, early 20s. That's because the human brain itself kind of settles down by that time. It still changes throughout your life, but most of the connections, most of the anatomical structures and everything is in place by the time you're in your early 20s, which means it's very difficult to change your character later on, to improve your character later on, right? It requires more effort, and it certainly requires an inner motivation. You don't do it just because somebody tells you to do it. It has to come from inside. Right. Well, but that's not surprising, right? It's also true, again, for music or for, let's say, languages. It's easier to learn a musical instrument or a new language when you are young than when you are older. That doesn't mean it can't be done later on in life. It just means it takes more effort, right? It takes more mindfulness. It takes more, sort of persistence and so on and so forth. But that also means this neuroscience understanding of how the human brain develops also means that the most important interventions we can do in terms of teaching people virtue and a better character is before their 20s. Right? So we should be teaching the basics of virtue in elementary school or middle school or high school. Later on at college level, it's already pretty late, and after college, it's hopeless unless, again, the person themselves want to make the effort.
I'm not sure how well we're doing at that.
Not very well. And I think we're not doing well for a number of reasons, one of which is that we just don't put a lot of emphasis, in fact, at all, on teaching virtue. These days, we teach a lot of things to kids, which they need to learn. I mean, math, science, literature, history, all those things are important. I have no qualms with it. But we don't teach morality. We don't teach ethics because we think that is not the business of teachers. Now, it's not the business of a history teacher, that's for sure, not the business of a math teacher, but there are teachers that could be doing that sort of job. They're called philosophers. And but the problem is that whenever this has been tried, especially in the United States, you tend to have, meaning teaching philosophy, critical thinking, ethics at a pre-college level, you tend to get a lot of resistance. And you get resistance from two quarters, usually, from politicians and from many parents. And then I started thinking about, why? What do these two categories have in common, politicians and parents? And then I thought, they're both authority figures. And if there is one thing that authority doesn't like, is to be questioned. And if you start teaching critical thinking and ethics to kids, then they will question the authority, both for their parents and
Yes.
their politicians. So,
I've made that mistake, Massimo. I've made that mistake with my son.
That may be why we don't do a good job. It's not by chance that we don't do a good job.
Yeah, because I was wondering, like, as you were talking about teaching virtue, number one, you answered kind of my first question, because my first question was going to be, kind of in the absence of having teachers to teach virtue, would that be proof that that it can't be taught? And you did a really good job answering that, but kind of to your second point that you just made with regards to, these figures and these public authoritative figures taking issue with teaching stuff like virtue and ethics, I think. Oh, and I wonder if you also think if it's a problem with, qualifications of the teacher. Like, do you have to be virtuous to teach virtue? And because it would seem like teaching something implies you've got a level of proficiency and or like authority in that particular area. So, do you have to be virtuous to teach virtue?
I would think so.
Teacher?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, you don't want a math teacher who doesn't know how to do math, and you don't, or in his own personal life, you don't want a music teacher who cannot play an instrument, that sort of stuff. You don't want a football coach who doesn't know how to play football, et cetera, right? Yes, we do expect a certain level of proficiency. We don't expect perfection necessarily. But we do expect a certain level of above average proficiency, because otherwise, what qualifies you from being a teacher? But look, this is true for other people who do teach, virtue, like preachers, for instance.
Indeed.
Religious, rabbis and imams and so on and so forth. I mean, there are monks and so on and so forth. We expect those people to be more virtuous, better people than average, because otherwise, again, why should I be listening to them? Now, as we know, sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not. But that's a matter of human frailty and human limitations. But the general idea is that, yes, of course, we do expect, if you claim to be able to teach something, I expect that you actually behave accordingly. And therefore, if the claim is I can teach wisdom, then I expect you to be wiser than average, because otherwise, why would I go to you?
Exactly.
That's so funny. And in your book, you have a chapter that talks about teaching virtue to politicians. So I'm wondering if maybe you can kind of unpack that a little bit, and if there's any implications for like our modern day politics today.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of implications for modern day politics. I mean, the book is allegedly or superficially about ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and politics, but in fact, things haven't changed that much in the intervening 2,000 years. That's why we still talk about Socrates, and this is why we still talk about the Stoics. And that's true also for religions, right? I mean, why is it that Christianity or the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith or Buddhism are still practiced today? Because things haven't changed that much over the 2,000 years intervened. Technologically, they have, right? Our technology and our science are incredibly more advanced than what they were 2,000 years ago. You wouldn't go to Aristotle today to learn your physics. That would be, or your biology. That would be ridiculous. But it turns out that in terms of ethics, things haven't changed that much. In terms of human needs and wants, things haven't changed that much, which is why we go back to ancient traditions and still learn something from it. But anyway, in order to address your question about the politicians, so there are 2 chapters in the book actually that tackle this issue of the relationship between virtue and politics. And in one of these chapters, I explore a number of case studies where a philosopher was trying to teach virtue to a politician. And I ask, how did that go? Now, philosopher here, we need to understand what we mean by the word. I don't mean somebody with a PhD in philosophy who spends their time thinking about abstruse thoughts, about very specific technical matters. That's what most modern philosophers do. By philosopher, I mean somebody who actually practices the art of living, who lives philosophically, right? So the first chapter, one of the 2 chapters is about what happens when philosophers, in that sense, practical philosophers, try to teach virtues to politicians. And then the following chapter is about, what happens when statesmen themselves are philosophers, meaning when somebody who is into politics also is trying to actively pursue a philosophical life. And the results, I think, are broadly fairly different. Like, when philosophers try to teach politicians, usually they fail. At least the track record is not that good. I talk in the book about Plato going to Syracuse and trying to teach the Dionysius II, who was the tyrant of Syracuse, about being more virtuous. And Plato almost got killed as a result. So that didn't go very well. Things were a little bit better between Aristotle and Alexander the Great. Alexander did, in fact, learn quite a bit from Aristotle. So that's a better case. Things were horrible between Seneca and Nero. Seneca was a first-century Roman senator and philosopher who tried to teach virtue to Nero, and things didn't go well. In the end, Nero essentially invited Seneca to commit suicide and that sort of stuff. So a lot of these examples don't work very well. And now we know why they don't go very well, because modern science tells us, as I said a few minutes ago, that by the time somebody gets to his early 20s, that's pretty much the closing of the window in terms of teaching virtue. Most of these people were older than that. Alexander was actually fairly young. He was 16 or 17, and that may be accounting a little bit for why Aristotle did a little better. Dionysius was definitely a mature man when Plato tried to interact with him, so things went disastrous. Nero is another interesting case. He was 17, but he was already kind of going into the wrong direction. He had already been taught essentially how to be unvirtuous, so it was very difficult to undo it. Now, the chapter, however, that deals with statesmen who themselves practice philosophy, there the results tend to be much better. One example is Cato the Younger, who was a Stoic senator in Republican Rome. He was so consistently virtuous and so consistently, honest and with character integrity, etc., that in ancient Rome, if you were slipping up on something, you were doing something not quite right, often the excuse would be, well, not everybody can be a Cato. So Cato was that kind of standard, universally recognized standard. It's like, that guy is really, really good. Another good example is Marcus Aurelius. Again, a Stoic who became emperor in the second century Rome, and very clearly he learned Stoicism early on in his life from a number of teachers, and he practiced Stoicism from when he was a teenager. And so when he became emperor, he tried consistently to apply Stoic principles to his policies, and by and large succeeded. And then another example is Julian, sometimes called the apostate, because he was the last pagan Roman emperor before the empire completely turned over to Christianity. Now, he didn't live long. He was killed in battle at some point when he was fairly young. But what we know of his life is that he actually started out as a practical philosopher. He started way before he was into the political side of things. He was trying to practice philosophy, and when he did become emperor, he acted in a fair and just way. So the bottom line is, if you either catch somebody very early on, as I said, before they're in their late teens or early 20s, or if somebody wants to be a good person, wants to practice, then you can definitely teach him, because these people are actually open to receiving advice from others.
Dude, this is so fascinating. One thing you said, Massimo, that really got my thoughts going, where you talked about how technologically and scientifically our world is light years away, like an unbelievable advancement. And yet there seems to be a durability to, maybe I call it ethical knowledge or moral knowledge. What's the difference between scientific knowledge, technological knowledge, and ethical knowledge? What is it about ethical and moral knowledge that you think has a kind of durability where the same lessons, as you said, right? Aristotle was a biologist. He was a scientist. Maybe even, and we've had different people that were inventors, right, in the past, and their inventions are done now, so we don't go necessarily look back at them for the next invention, unless it's for inspiration or something. But right. I'm just wondering, what do you think, and in your research, what have you found, and what do you think is the difference between those kinds of knowledge, ethical, moral versus scientific and technological?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, and the answer, or at least my answer, might surprise you a little bit. So, the major difference between the two is that scientific knowledge is factual knowledge. It's knowledge of facts about the world, right? And there is an infinite number of facts about the world. So we keep discovering things. We keep discovering new planets, new galaxies, new life forms, new species, new everything. It's almost endless. Okay, and that accounts for the fact that we've been making steady progress. Well, I don't know about steady, because there was such a thing as the Middle Ages, where we didn't make much progress for several centuries. But more or less, we have made progress, especially over the last 200 or 300 years. We've made huge leaps forward. That's because it's factual knowledge, and there is essentially an infinite number of facts. Ethical knowledge is really about understanding how to live with other human beings, because ethics fundamentally is about how to relate to other people, how to live in a society. And there, I think that the ancients, not just the Greco-Romans, but ancient people that lived in China, in India, in Japan, in Africa, and so on, they pretty much figured it out. That's it. It's like, there is a certain number of things you need to do in order to live well with other people. And nobody has been able to improve on that, because there's nothing to improve. We're done. The only thing is, we don't have enough people to actually understand what needs to be done and want to do it. So the question is a question of teaching, not a question of discovering. Pretty much, in my mind, the Greco-Romans, the cultures of the Middle East, the Confucians, the Buddhists, etc., with a few differences between them, they pretty much got it right. What you need to do in order to live with other people is to cooperate, to treat people with respect, with reciprocity, to being helpful to others because others are helpful to you, that sort of stuff. It's really not rocket science, as they say. right? And once you figure out the basics of what to do or what not to do, and maybe a few techniques like meditation techniques and things like that to help you actually work in that direction, then what needs to be done at that point is just to work on it. There's not much in the way of discovery that needs to be done. That is why I think Confucius, Jesus, Seneca, or Socrates are still relevant today, because they pretty much got it right. We can always make small changes and small improvements, but the broad picture was there already 2,000 years ago.
With all the division in our country, and a lot of the just the political venom that gets thrown around, both kind of at the micro level between like individuals, and then also the stuff you see like happen, whether it's January 6th or what have you, like who would be the ideal teachers of virtue? And maybe that's an unanswerable question, but it's like, we know that a lot of politicians have spiritual leaders, that give them, whatever advice or what have you. But, I could probably make an argument that they're ineffective, or their intentions are motivated by politics.
Right.
So I'm curious on who would be those people, that could give our political leaders the advice today.
I don't have a problem with spiritual advisors, so long as they know what they're doing, and then they know what they're talking about. The Dalai Lama comes to mind pretty obviously. He's a spiritual advisor, or he's what I would consider a practical philosopher. And I think there are plenty of people I don't know about plenty, but there are several people like that. The problem is, as you pointed out, that many politicians, if they do go to spiritual advisors, do it for political reasons, for gathering favor, essentially, in order to project this image that they're trying to be good and all that sort of stuff. But they really don't mean it. Most of them don't mean it. I don't want to say everybody doesn't mean it, but most of them don't mean it. And that is where I get to near the end of the book. It is, why is it that we have such a disconnect that most of us, so the data is interesting here. As I said before, social scientists have pretty good evidence that most of us want to be good people. They want to improve. Often we overestimate how good we are already, but nevertheless, we want to be good, right? On the other hand, the same data shows that there are certain categories of people that have a very high frequency of sociopaths. And guess what? The two categories with the highest degree of sociopathy are finance and politics.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
No, right? It doesn't. Exactly. It shouldn't surprise us. So, but then the question is, but wait a minute, who puts these people in charge? And in the case of politics, it's us, my friends. We are the ones putting it in charge, right? At least
and maybe finance too.
And maybe to some extent,
indirectly, yes.
Indirectly, right? I don't hire people on Wall Street, but I certainly vote for politicians who make decisions about
money.
How to regulate. Yeah, exactly. How to regulate.
And we vote for their money. Yeah,
right?
totally.
Yeah. So the bottom line is that at least in societies that are more or less democratic, like ours, because if you're talking about totalitarian societies, that's a whole different issue. Autocratic society, it's a very difficult issue. But if you're talking about societies like ours, where more or less there is a certain degree of democracy, then really the buck stops with us. We are ultimately responsible. It's easy to blame the politicians, or look at how crooked that person is. Look, I can't believe that he's doing this or that or the other. Yeah, but who voted for that politician? We did, right? And so I think that ultimately this is where the things really get both interesting, I think, and difficult. That is, ultimately the quest for character is not just a personal quest. It's not just about us individually trying to become better people, which is good. It's a good thing. It's also a social quest. It's a question of realizing that we want people of good character in charge of things, because if we don't have those people, then it's no surprise. We shouldn't be surprised that the people in charge do things that are not in the interest of the polis, of the community.
That's so good. It's so funny because we just did we had a podcast with a congressman, and they made the point that if we weren't so divided as a polis, then the politicians would be so divided. So essentially, they're mirroring us, which was really interesting. Yeah. The way he said that, I was like, huh. And it makes me think, and I'm super curious about this and how you treat this in the book, and even with your research, your thoughts on this. There's a classic view, right? Like that's encapsulated in the phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, or something like that, right?
Yep.
So that, that's the idea that this power has this corruptive, almost automatically degenerating effect on morality and character. I'm curious as to what you think about that, and if you found that to be true in your research, false, or back and forth. What is the relationship between power and virtue?
Yeah, I honestly think that the notion that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is nonsense on stilts. It's a way to, so in other words, very tall order of nonsense. It's a way to shift the blame on something else, right? Power is not a thing. It's not. It's not a thing that you can say, look at this thing. It's doing something to me. No,
right.
Power is a concept. It's a human concept, right?
Indeed.
So what corrupts a politician is his own lack of character. That is what corrupts.
That'll
not
preach.
Power.
You just gave me you never thought you'd give the preacher a sermon for the weekend, did you?
No, I never did that. But I'm glad that I can help, right? So in other words, it's their own damn fault. There is nothing that says that if you have, we do have examples, for instance, of near absolute power not corrupting. One of them at the founding of this very republic, George Washington.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
George Washington was asked by people to be essentially president for the rest of his life. And he said, no, we just fought a war to get rid of tyranny and kings. I don't want to be one of those. Now, he's not the only example. Washington is often portrayed, there are several paintings and at least one statue, when he's portrayed in the garbs of an ancient Roman. And that ancient Roman happened to be a guy named Cincinnatus, after which the city of Cincinnati is actually named. And Cincinnatus was a retired Roman general who, during the Republican period, in I think it's the 2nd or 3rd century BC, there was a big threat against Rome. So some enemy from outside was coming in, and the senators were desperate, and so they called Cincinnatus, who was the best general available, and said, look, we're going to give you absolute power for 6 months. See what you can do to get rid of this problem. Cincinnatus did get rid of the problem, and then at the end of the period, he just said, okay, here's your power back. I'm going to go back to my little field and cultivate it, because that's what I was doing before. So, and Washington was aware of the story of Cincinnatus. He actually mentioned Cincinnatus, right? So those examples, and there are several others, show that no, power does not have to corrupt. It only corrupts people who are already corrupted. And that's the problem. If we keep putting those people in charge, then it's no surprise that if you give them power, they use them for their own needs and wants and not for ours.
I love that. I was thinking, like, for me, for an example of that, I would go in my own philosophy and worldview. I would go to Jesus as the prime example of power that was not corrupted. And yet, I'm saying, but he had an advantage in my worldview because he was the God,
he's a god,
essentially.
Right.
So he had a little more. He had advantage, so that's good. Yeah, and this
he had an advantage. But people like Washington or Cincinnatus and several others did not have that advantage.
I agree.
And
I agree.
So that shows that a human being, the right human being, put in charge under those conditions, will do the right thing.
I like that. I like that a lot. But here's kind of my last question, and then the last one will be more about your own projects, where we can get, follow you and stuff like that. But so here's kind of the question. So, this is This is a podcast about religion and politics. By the way, I could listen to you for hours. I just love it's really we're not going to be able to do that obviously, but I really love asking these questions.
I appreciate it.
Really, but so religion. Let's think about. You can say religion in general. I know Christianity had a particular influence on the West. What's the connection between religion and virtue that you found over the millennia? Would we have virtue without religion? How has religion helped? How has it hurt virtue? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think of religion as a type of philosophy of life. So I don't see Christianity as being fundamentally different from Stoicism, let's say, or Buddhism or anything like that.
Gotcha.
And the reason for saying that is because I think that pretty much all religions and all practical philosophies have three components in common. They have a metaphysics, meaning an account of how the world works. Right? In the case of Christianity, the world was created by a God with certain characteristics, etc., etc. Yep. In the case of the Stoics, the world is the result of cause and effect and matter, and etc. They also have an ethics, meaning an account of how you should live in the world. Right? In the case of Christianity, 10 Commandments, the teachings of Jesus, etc., etc. In the case of the Stoics, is the 4 virtues and things like that. And then there are exercises, practices. Right? In the case of Christianity, you go to church, you read scriptures, you listen to sermons, you engage with other Christians talking about ethical matters and so on and so forth. And in the case of the Stoics, you pretty much do the same thing. You read Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or Seneca, you discuss it, etc. You don't go to church, but that's not much of a difference. So in my mind, when people want to draw a sharp distinction between religion and philosophy, there isn't any. It's just that religions are philosophies with a particular type of metaphysics, where you invoke a supernatural component to existence in the world. But that's it. I mean, in fact, the Stoics did believe in God. It's just they didn't believe in a God that is external to the universe. They believed that the universe itself is God. So they were pantheists. But it's not like they were not. They didn't believe in anything transcendental.
Right.
So, so I don't think there is much of a difference. If there is not much of a difference, then religions have the same advantages and limitations of philosophies. They can have a positive effect on morality if they're done well, if people are genuinely wanting to learn, and if they have good leaders. And the Catholic Church or the Christian Church in general has had good leaders in the past and probably now. I mean, I'm not as familiar with current leadership, but they probably are there. And of course, it has also had bad leaders in the past. I mean, Catholic popes during the Renaissance were literally going to battle and slaughtering people. Not exactly a Christian thing to do, I would think. So, those are bad examples. The same goes for philosophy. I mean, there are good practical philosophers, the kind of people like Socrates, who you actually want to learn from. And then there are, sophists, and there are bad people who just don't know what they're talking about, or they talk about things that are actually self-aggrandizing and, feed their narcissism, etc., etc. So I really don't think that there is any radical distinction there to be made between a philosophy of life or a practical philosophy and religions.
Wow, that's so good. Well, Will, you got any more questions?
No, I'm just mesmerized. So this has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Massimo, how can people follow you, and where can they get your stuff, and what are you working on next? I can remind you of those questions.
Sounds good. So the book, of course, is available wherever you buy books, online, in person, whatever you want to do it. In terms of following my work, there is one place, MassimoPigliucci.org. There you'll find links to all my books, my essays, my podcasts, videos, anything.
There is a silent G in Pigliucci.
That's right.
P-I-G-L, so just remember.
Correct. That's right. And as far as the next project, well, I'm about next semester to go on sabbatical, so that means I'll have a whole year to just read and write. No teaching involved at all.
That's awesome.
And I'm going to probably be working on a book on skepticism, which was another one of the major Greco-Roman philosophies, other than Stoicism and Epicureanism. The third big one was skepticism, particularly the skepticism that was practiced by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was a Roman near the end, who lived near the end of the Republic, first century BC. And he was a public advocate, so a lawyer. He was a philosopher, and he was a statesman. And his life was just as interesting as the one by Alcibiades, but he really did try to be helpful to other people and to his society. So I'm going to try to follow Cicero. I'm going to visit several of the locations where he lived throughout the Mediterranean, and then write about his perspective on the world and why it might still be relevant to us today.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and maybe the next time we meet again, there'll be some producer or director listening to this that will pick up your book and say, we should write a movie about this.
We should write a movie about this. Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Massimo. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
The pleasure has been mine. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Well, guys, thank you. We'll see you next time. Until then, stay informed, and see you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.